Okay, so here we are looking at Chapter 20, the Americas and Oceania, although for this purposes we're primarily going to talk Oceania first and then focus on the Americas. Primarily we are looking at the Aztec and the Incan empires with the Americas as the focus. So our goals are to explain how and why states in Oceania developed and changed over time, and doing the same thing for states and societies within the Americas at the same point. Right? And I need to, when we do this in class, break that up a little bit. So in Oceania, so we're talking about essentially this entire region of the Pacific Ocean beyond, Papua New Guinea and Australia. All right, and you kind of mentioned Australia a little bit there. So essentially, we break this up into different groups that have kind of, migrated over time via the seas through pretty much the central part of the Pacific Ocean, predominantly in between the equator and the Tropic of Capricorn. So Aborigines occupy Australia and mostly are nomadic hunter-gatherers. They're not very large societies, kind of spread throughout the Australian, well, we'd say continent, but well, in a sense, the continent. So mainly trading with groups on the respective islands, occasionally with other Pacific Islanders, based on location. All right, and religions and myths are mostly tied to the local land. And obviously the book will go more in depth than we will here. The seafaring people, kind of, I think, in a sense, you can go with the idea of Moana from Disney. Seafaring Polynesian societies kind of begin to expand over time. You can kind of see the map here, based on these islands and island chains, further and further beyond, those areas, coming initially into the Papua New Guinea area, Vanuatu, New Caledonia. Coming in from Asia, and then again, as we said, expanding throughout the Pacific. Many of the islands could hold agricultural societies, leading to complex societies, again, based on the fact that when you get agriculture, that essentially means that there is a delineage of power and structure, and in terms of societal roles and statuses. So the island clusters essentially trade with one another, trading food, axes, ships, within their small little groups. So places like within the Fiji area, you have those island groups trading with one another, Tonga, Cook Islands, the Hawaiian Islands, such and such, but pretty much not exactly trading all that much with islands that are further away, because that means that you have to travel longer, and there's more dangers involved in that, including spoilage of the foods. So with that, in terms of also the spread of, obviously, goods and, weapons and ships, we also see the spread of culture, again, language and religion, that builds the wealth for the elites on each little island chain, again, creating those social classes and, hierarchies, which also comes in with the idea of political alliances between different island groups, sometimes conquering one another. Other times they are working in concert with one another to establish and hold on to power and possibly defend against other outside groups. And also, we get the diversifying of diets, again, because related to that movement of people and the movement of their goods and things that they're discovering on given islands throughout the area. One thing we're going to look at a little bit in class if we get the time is that overproduction of land mixing with dense populations could cause conflict and destruction. Think about kind of what happened on Easter Island, and again, we'll hopefully get a chance to look further into that within class. But again, if you overpopulate an area and you have a hard year or so, or you've done too much damage to the environment and you can't necessarily repair it or produce enough to feed everybody living there, it could cause conflict and destruction. So that is something to definitely keep in mind, is that overproduction and overpopulation can lead to negative results within any given area, particularly you're looking at some examples here. All right, so switching gears, kind of doing a complete 180 here, looking at the ancient American empire. So for this piece especially, we want to talk about explaining how and why states in the Americas developed and changed over time, but also looking at beliefs and cultures of the Aztec and the Incas, and contrasting the two with their previous cultures. So the idea here is that over time, back when there was still kind of like ice and a land bridge connecting Asia, predominantly Siberia and Russia, into Alaska and Canada, that's a belief that people came over that way over time and then kind of just spread throughout North and South America. So we get this little image here, hunting and gathering societies, predominantly, again, within the forests and the deserts and the plains within North America, and then plains farmers, the mound builders here. Think about the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Seminoles, the Iroquois Confederacy, and then moving further and further down into actual states and empires getting built predominantly in the area of Mesoamerica. So think southern Mexico, connecting into Belize and a few other locations, and then also with the Andes Mountain area as well. All right, and so you get a very large variety of different groups that kind of establish over time as they're continually migrating over long periods. All right, so we're not only talking about the Mayan Empire here, or not the Mayan Empire, but the Mayan civilization that was kind of located here on the Yucatan Peninsula that just kind of disappeared, at least as a civilization. The Mayan people still exist today, and there are those connections. People that actually have, essentially direct descendants are pretty close to it in those locations, but their society kind of faded, or their civilizations faded away around the time that the Aztec Empire, predominantly based around what we now know to be Mexico City, here. Right? And we really do mean the use of the word empire. Right? And again, I want to fix this when we get to class. But anyway, so essentially the Aztec, also known as the Mexica, so you can think of where the term Mexican comes from, essentially are believed to have come from northern Mexico and migrated into kind of the central part of where now is Mexico City, forming around what is Lakes Texcoco, and they built the city of Tenochtitlan, which we'll see an image of, or at least an image and a map of here in a minute. And so they build it on this massive lake, this little island, and essentially they build a bunch of bridges, pretty unique engineering, to build bridges to connect the city to the outlying parts of the lake, and then establish their empire kind of at that point. I'm going to pause. So continuing to, so talking about the building of bridges and connecting them to the mainland, they also build, as the population grows, in order to sustain themselves better with more local foods, they build chinampas, which are kind of, they raise the land out of the sea or out of the lake, and essentially they grow these little farming communities, and kind of see them here, top right corner. And essentially, these little, farming islands that are connected to the area, and essentially that allows more people to live within the area of Tenochtitlan, and then resulting like suburban areas. But also allowing more, or giving people more land to farm in order to keep the food more local and to support the growing population. Tenochtitlan itself will have, several hundreds of thousands of people located within the city and just outside the city limits, and then the empire itself will have like almost estimate somewhere between 5 to 20 million people, which is a very large group to have, not very far spread out. So anyway, the Aztec and the Mexica, essentially they expand through warfare over agricultural societies that existed before, forcing the people that they conquer to pay tribute in terms of money, military supplies, food, jewelry, other goods and services. And so if the tribute is paid, conquered people are left alone. If not, there is violent retribution. And because of the actions of the Aztec, they face a lot of revolts inside and also within kind of their border neighborhoods. But they also have a lot of allies that just kind of go along with it. And we'll talk about human sacrifice here later on in the video. So as wealth expands, so do social class distinctions. That is shown off in the clothing and hairstyle. Distinctively within the Aztec themselves, their warrior class, whenever they kill or capture somebody, there is a lot of prestige and honor in terms of how they dress themselves or how they design themselves based on their warrior status. So that becomes really, really essential. One thing within the Aztec tradition is that the merchants can rise in social status because of trade with allied or conquered peoples. They have the ability to earn wealth and actually rise in the same rate as the noble or religious classes, right? Which is, very unique. So here is like Texcoco, Tenochtitlan, and then the Chinampas kind of around that same area. You can kind of see kind of built up and bridges extending themselves throughout the area. So much so that when the Spanish do actually arrive, they actually are completely amazed at everything that they built. So you can kind of see the Chinampas spread throughout the entirety of the lake and then surrounding areas throughout much of these areas. Sorry, down here, the Chinampas, not over here. These are the marshes that kind of surround the lake. But anyway, still spread throughout and to the other locations. Right. So switching gears a little bit to the Incan Empire. One thing we'll talk about in class, benefits and difficulties to living in a mountain civilization, and then, yeah. So anyway, so the empire of the Incas is way bigger than the actual Aztec Empire, and it continues to expand, and as it expands, as we've said with other societies, you need a big bureaucracy to support it, much in the same way with China within Dar al-Islam. All right, as their nations and their empires get bigger, they need a bigger bureaucracy and a well-trained one in order to support it. And so there are believed to be about 80 provinces that are conquered or ruled by the Incas, based again out of the main city of Cusco, very close to where Machu Picchu is today, and they assume that that was the capital, and everything was kind of run via there. And so the Inca governors overran or oversaw the 80 odd localities and essentially working with some cases local officials to essentially look over the land and resources that technically belong to the government, investing in resource and land redistribution and construction and irrigation products. There's almost no privatization outside of the emperor, or known as the Inca, um, within the empire. There's almost no, you know, free enterprise. There's no free trade. It's pretty much almost all controlled by the government. So this is like a very, if you want to give it a comparison, think the idea of a pure form of socialism where the government is almost in charge of almost every aspect of society, and it is in control of the trade in terms of the projects, and everyone has to give back in terms of something into the state. In order to ensure that their empire is very strong and they have connections to what they need to get to, there are storehouses and roads that connect essentially the empire back to Cusco along the entirety of that. And they're building everything along the way. And then there are way stations and inns and storehouses, essentially one day away from each other. So you're never more than a day away from a strong Andes or a strong Inca position. One of the things that they're really well known for in terms of their record keeping was the quipu, all right, which is a knotted cord that serves as a counting device. So essentially each knot, is representing of something, whether that is birth, death, marriages, food that is produced, food that is being stored, harvest dates, trade transactions, stories are even apparently supposed to be kept on the quipu. So you have to be really, really intelligent to know what these were. Many of them were destroyed by the Spanish when they did in fact come over and take over in the 1500s. So again, really kind of unique design without, the idea of like a written down language. This was kind of how they recorded and held on to information, which is a very unique way of doing it. So obviously you have to be trained to know what exactly each chord means. So the empire expanded over time because each ruler, and this connects back to more religious aspects, believed that they needed to add new land and wealth to the empire to secure their place in the afterlife. So there's a veneration here of the dead, sort of like a cult of the dead. So once they're dead and mummified, they act as intermediaries with the gods in order to, get that status and that idea that they are, strong leaders. They have to continually add to the state. So that's constant warfare, constant expansion, and constant growth as a result. For their enemies, when they conquered them or would threaten to conquer them, they essentially made them part of the empire. But even if they did surrender, even if they didn't surrender, they still allowed them to keep their local customs, and they allowed them to keep their local rulers in exchange for loyalty, even if ones that they had to forcibly take. They did this in order to, again, provide that everything was going to be the same within their empire and keep things more integrated, or at least they tried to. So they did that. They brought the conquered peoples together, tried to integrate them through a number of means. Within that, while keeping local customs, there's a number of things that they did. Okay, using the one official language with the rulers, that is the Quechua language, teaching Inca and Incan values in schools. All roads, again, leading to the Capitol building. All government buildings essentially are looking the same throughout the empire, so there's not a whole lot of diversity there. Forced resettlement. So essentially, it's believed to be about 1/4 of the people inside the Incan Empire were moved to different locations to prevent them from rebelling, and that way, again, they got more integrated into other societies and other groups within there. They also would reward loyal subjects by moving you up in a status and moving you to a different location. They allowed them to worship the main Inca, or they made them worship or at least acknowledge the main Inca deities, but again, carrying their own traditions and beliefs. And there's also that mita system. So everyone works for the state, and as a result is taken care of by the state. So an example, working part of the land for the government, part of the land for the religion, and then part of their own land while they receive good and aid redistributed throughout the entirety of the empire. So an example of the government is going to give you wool. The example is that you are going to make that cloth mostly for yourself, but also for the empire. All right, so there's kind of a give and take here. Everyone's taken care of, or at least supposed to be taken care of by the government. So again, like we talked about, this is kind of an idea of that socialism here. All right. Running out of time here a little bit, so we'll mention the human sacrifice piece, because both definitely play in with human sacrifice. With the Aztec, both of them is kind of supporting and keeping the gods happy. With the Aztec, they're doing it by bloodletting, so essentially killing tributes and killing conquered people in order to do that. So this means that there's a continuing demand of tributes and kind of strengthening the warrior class and the religious class. And so you can kind of read through that. Same thing, the Incas do the same thing. Not as much with conquered people, but they use children, they use llamas in order to keep that. And then you can kind of see, we'll talk about gender roles a bit in the classroom as well. So that's where we're going to stop, as we are kind of running out of time here. But hopefully, again, skimming the surface as an introduction.